I'm Margaret Sullivan, 42, and for 15 years I believed my husband died of natural causes. David was just 38 when the cancer took him, too young, too sudden, but these things happen, right? That's what I told myself until I found his hidden medical files last month. The radiation readings, the timeline that matched perfectly with his work at 3 Mile Island, the doctor's notes they never shared with me. My grief turned to rage when I realized the truth. They knew. They all knew. But what I discovered about the cover-up and what I did next would expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever wondered how far they'll go to bury the truth, like this video, because this story isn't just about my David anymore. I keep our wedding photo on my nightstand. David in his navy suit, me in my grandmother's lace dress, both of us glowing with the kind of hope you only have at 23. We married in June 1978, right after he got the job at 3 Mile Island. Nuclear energy is the future, Maggie, he'd say, running his fingers through my hair as we planned our life together. Clean, safe, reliable. We're going to change the world. The plant was the pride of Pennsylvania then, a gleaming symbol of American innovation rising from the Susquehanna River. David felt honored to be part of it. Working as a maintenance technician in the reactor building, he'd come home with stories about the sophisticated safety systems, the multiple backup protocols, the brilliant engineers who'd thought of everything. It's like working inside a spaceship, he told me one evening, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. The technology is incredible. They've made it impossible for anything to go wrong. I believed him because I believed in him. David had always been the smartest person I knew, valedictorian of his high school class, full scholarship to Penn State for engineering. If he said nuclear power was safe, it was safe. If he said we were building a better future, we were. We rented a small house in Middletown, just 15 minutes from the plant. Close enough for David to bike to work on nice days. Far enough that we felt we had our own little slice of paradise. I got a job at the local bank, and we started talking about children, about the family we'd raise in this safe, prosperous community. The neighborhood was full of young couples like us, many of them employed by the plant. We'd have barbecues on weekends, the men discussing reactor temperatures and containment protocols, while the women planned baby showers and talked about expanding their houses. Everyone seemed so confident, so secure in the promise of this new technology. But even then, there were whispers. Mrs. Henderson next door mentioned that her husband, who worked at the plant since it opened, had been feeling tired lately, probably just working too hard. She'd laugh, but I caught the worry in her eyes. Another neighbor's teenage son had developed a persistent cough that doctors couldn't explain. It's just coincidence, David would assure me when I brought up these concerns. People get sick all the time. It has nothing to do with the plant. I wanted to believe him. We all did. David left for work that Wednesday morning like any other day, kissing me goodbye at the kitchen door, his metalwork badge clipped to his shirt pocket. "See you tonight, beautiful," he said, grabbing his lunch from the counter. I can still see that badge gleaming in the morning sunlight. It would become evidence I never knew existed. At 4 a.m., something went wrong. I didn't know it then, sleeping peacefully in our bed. But inside Unit 2's reactor building where David worked, a series of mechanical failures and human errors had triggered what would become the worst nuclear accident in American history. The first I heard of it was David's phone call around 7:30 a.m. I was getting ready for work when the phone rang, his voice tight with controlled panic. "Maggie, I need you to listen to me carefully," he said, background noise crackling through the receiver. "There's been an incident at the plant. I'm okay, but I need to stay here to help with the emergency response." "What kind of incident?" My heart started racing. "David, are you safe?" "Everything's under control," he said, but I could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. "The safety systems are working exactly as designed. I need to do my job right now. I'll be home as soon as I can." The line went dead, leaving me standing in our kitchen, still in my bathrobe, fear creeping up my spine like ice water. I turned on the television, but the news reports were confusing and contradictory. Officials from Metropolitan Edison, the plant's operator, insisted there was no danger to the public, a minor malfunction, they called it. Everything is under control. But the reporters looked skeptical, and emergency vehicles kept arriving at the plant. Hours passed. I called the plant's main number repeatedly, but the lines were either busy or I was told that all personnel were in meetings. By afternoon, Pennsylvania's Lieutenant Governor William Scranton was on television saying the situation was more complex than the company first led us to believe. My hands shook as I made coffee, watching the news coverage intensify. Helicopter footage showed steam venting from the plant's cooling towers, and experts were using words like partial meltdown and radiation release. David didn't come home that night, or the next. When he finally walked through our door on Friday evening, he looked like he'd aged 5 years. His face was gray with exhaustion, his clothes wrinkled and stained. But it was his eyes that frightened me most. They held a knowledge he couldn't share, a weight he couldn't put down. "I can't talk about what happened," he said when I peppered him with questions. "We signed agreements, but Maggie," he pulled me close, holding me tighter than he ever had. "I love you so much. Promise me you know that." I didn't understand then why he sounded like he was saying goodbye. The changes started subtly, weeks after the accident. David began coming home exhausted, not the normal tiredness of a hard day's work, but a bone-deep fatigue that sleep couldn't cure. He'd collapse into his recliner after dinner, sometimes falling asleep with his plate still in his lap. "Maybe you should see Dr. Morrison," I suggested one evening in late April, watching him struggle to keep his eyes open during the news. "I'm fine, Maggie. Just working a lot of overtime. The cleanup is," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "it's demanding." But I could see he wasn't fine. His appetite disappeared first. The man who used to devour my pot roast and ask for seconds now picked at his food, pushing it around his plate. When I asked if something was wrong with my cooking, he'd force a smile and take a few bites, but I could tell even that was an effort. Then came the nausea. Morning after morning, I'd hear him in the bathroom, retching violently. When I knocked on the door, he'd call out that it was probably just something he ate. But we both knew better. His medicine cabinet slowly filled with over-the-counter remedies, antacids, stomach soothers, anti-nausea medications that barely helped. The worst part was watching his skin change. David had always had a healthy tan from working outdoors during his college summers, but now he looked pale, almost gray. Dark circles appeared under his eyes, making him look hollow and sick. "You need to see a doctor," I insisted in June, after finding him doubled over in the kitchen, gripping the counter. "For support. The company doctors have been monitoring all of us," he said, straightening up slowly. "They say it's normal to feel run down after what we've been through. Stress reactions, they call it." "What about the other guys? Are they feeling like this too?" David's jaw tightened. "We don't really talk about it." But I started paying attention. At the grocery store, I'd see other plant wives looking worried, their husbands appearing thinner, more tired. Mrs. Henderson mentioned that her Bob had been having trouble sleeping, waking up in cold sweats. Another neighbor said her husband had developed a persistent rash that wouldn't respond to treatment. "It's probably just stress," we'd tell each other. "The accident was traumatic. They need time to recover." The plant's health department sent out reassuring newsletters. "Post-incident fatigue is common among emergency response personnel," one stated. "These symptoms are temporary and will resolve as personnel adjust to normal operations." They recommended rest, proper nutrition, and patience. I wanted to believe them. David wanted to believe them. But as summer turned to fall, instead of getting better, he was getting worse. The prescription bottles multiplied on our bathroom counter, something for nausea, something for headaches, something to help him sleep, something to help him stay awake. "The doctors know what they're doing," he'd say when I expressed concern. "They're monitoring everything. If there was really something wrong, they'd tell us." I held on to that promise like a lifeline, not knowing that some promises are meant to be broken. By December 1982, David could barely get out of bed. What had started as fatigue and nausea had progressed to severe weakness, persistent fevers, and a frightening susceptibility to every cold and infection that came his way. When he developed pneumonia just before Christmas, I finally put my foot down. "We're going to the hospital," I told him, watching him shiver under 3 blankets despite the fever burning through his body. "I don't care what the company doctors say." Dr. Sarah Chen at Harrisburg Hospital took one look at David and ordered a battery of tests: blood work, chest x-rays, bone marrow biopsy. The hospital bracelet they gave him was white plastic with black lettering his name, date of birth, and a patient number that I memorized without meaning to. I kept that bracelet after he died, a tangible reminder of the beginning of our final battle. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to sit down," Dr. Chen said, when she called us back to discuss the results. Her voice was gentle but firm, the tone doctors use when they're about to shatter your world. David has acute lymphoblastic leukemia, she continued. It's an aggressive form of blood cancer that affects the white blood cells. Given the rapid progression of his symptoms, we need to begin treatment immediately. The words hit me like a physical blow. Cancer. My healthy, strong, 35-year-old husband had cancer. I reached for his hand, feeling how thin and frail it had become. I don't understand, I whispered. He's so young. How did this happen? Dr. Chen frowned, looking through David's chart. That's what's puzzling. This type of leukemia typically affects children or adults over 60. For someone David's age to develop such an aggressive case is unusual. She looked up at us. Has he been exposed to any radiation recently? High doses of radiation are a known risk factor for leukemia. David and I exchanged glances. He works at 3 Mile Island, I said slowly. He was there during the accident. The doctor's expression shifted, becoming more alert. How much exposure did he receive? The company said minimal, David answered, his voice hoarse. They monitored all of us. We were told the radiation levels were well within safe limits. Dr. Chen made notes in his chart, her pen moving quickly. I'd like to see those exposure records, if possible. The pattern of your symptoms, the timeline, the specific type of cancer it's consistent with radiation exposure effects. That was the first time anyone in the medical community had suggested a connection between David's illness and the accident. For nearly 4 years, we'd been told by plant officials that there were no health effects, no long-term consequences, no cause for concern. But they tested him. I protested. They've been monitoring all the workers. Surely they would have said something. If Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Chen interrupted gently, radiation-induced cancers can take years to develop. And sometimes, the initial monitoring doesn't capture the full extent of exposure, especially in emergency situations. The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped David's bed rail, trying to process what she was saying. Are you telling me that his cancer is because of 3 Mile Island? I can't make that determination without seeing his exposure records and conducting further tests. But the timing and presentation are certainly suggestive. She leaned forward, her expression serious. Right now, though, we need to focus on fighting this disease. The good news is that we've caught it early enough that treatment has a real chance of success. Treatment, the word that would dominate our lives for the next 2 years, consuming our savings, our energy, and ultimately, our hope. The chemotherapy schedule became my Bible, a detailed chart I kept on our refrigerator, marking each treatment, date, dosage, and side effect with meticulous precision. Tuesday mornings at 8 a.m., Thursday afternoons at 2 p.m., Saturday sessions that lasted 6 hours. I color-coded everything: blue for treatment days, red for blood work, green for the brief periods when David felt strong enough to leave the house. Dr. Chun's treatment plan was aggressive but hopeful. We're going to hit this hard and fast, she explained during our first oncology consultation. David's young and otherwise healthy. His body should be able to handle the intensive regimen. For the first few months, it seemed to be working. David's blood counts improved, his energy returned in small bursts, and we allowed ourselves to believe we were winning. I took a leave of absence from the bank to drive him to appointments and manage his care. Our savings account, built up over 5 years of marriage, began its steady decline toward zero. But David was determined to fight. Between treatments, he researched alternative therapies, dietary changes, experimental protocols being tested at MAJOR cancer centers. Our kitchen table became command central, covered with medical journals, printouts from the library, and correspondence with specialists across the country. There's a new treatment at Johns Hopkins, he'd say, showing me an article he'd highlighted. Immunotherapy combined with reduced-dose chemo. We should ask Dr. Chen about it. I loved seeing that spark in his eyes, the David I'd married emerging through the fog of illness. We drove to Philadelphia for a second opinion, to New York to consult with a leukemia specialist, to Boston to explore a clinical trial. Each trip felt like a mission. Each new doctor a potential savior. The hardest part was maintaining hope while watching him suffer. The chemotherapy that was supposed to save him was also destroying him. He lost 40 pounds, his hair, his appetite for anything beyond survival. There were nights when I'd lie awake listening to him struggle to breathe, when I'd find him vomiting in the bathroom at 3 a.m., too weak to call for help. But we had good days too. days when his blood counts were stable and we could pretend we were just a normal couple again. We'd drive to our favorite ice cream shop, walk through the park where we'd had our first date, talk about the trips we'd take when he was better. "When this is over," David would say, holding my hand as we sat by the Susquehanna River, "we're going to travel, see the world, maybe go to Ireland like we always talked about." I started noticing other plant workers at the hospital. Mike Rodriguez, from David's shift, getting treatment for thyroid cancer. Janet Walsh's husband Tom, dealing with liver problems that doctors couldn't explain. We'd nod at each other in the waiting room, a silent acknowledgement of our shared experience, but we never talked about what we all suspected. "It's probably just coincidence," I'd tell myself. "Cancer happens to lots of people," but the coincidences were adding up, and deep down, I was starting to wonder if we were all fighting the same enemy. David died on a Tuesday morning in September 1984, just as the sun was streaming through the windows of his hospital room. The doctors had moved him to palliative care 3 weeks earlier when the latest round of chemotherapy failed to stop the cancer's relentless advance. "We've done everything we can," Dr. Chen said gently. "Now it's about comfort and time." In those final weeks, David seemed to find a peace that had eluded him during the worst of his treatment. The desperate urgency of fighting was replaced by quiet acceptance and an intense need to connect with the people he loved. He wrote letters to his parents, to his sister, to his best friend from college. But the longest letter was for me. "I need you to promise me something, Maggie," he said one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. The effort of speaking exhausted him now, but his eyes were clear and focused. "When I'm gone, don't stop living. Don't let this what's happened to us. Don't let it steal your future too." I wanted to protest, to tell him he was going to get better, but we'd moved beyond those comfortable lies. Instead, I held his hand and listened as he talked about his hopes for my life after him. "Find someone who makes you laugh," he said. "Have children if you want them. Travel to Ireland for both of us." The letter he wrote was sealed in an envelope, with my name on it. "Don't read this until after," he instructed. "It's for when you need to remember how much I love you." On that final Tuesday, I was sleeping in the chair beside his bed when his breathing changed. The steady rhythm that had become my lullaby grew shallow and irregular. I woke instantly, some primal instinct alerting me that the end was near. "David," I whispered, taking his hand. His eyes opened, finding mine with surprising clarity. "Love you, Maggie," he managed to say. "Thank you for fighting with me." "I love you too," I whispered back, leaning close so he could hear me. "Rest now. I'll be okay." He smiled then, the ghost of the grin that had made me fall in love with him 8 years earlier. His grip on my hand loosened, his breathing slowed, and then, with a gentleness that surprised me, he was gone. The silence that followed was profound. No machines beeping, no nurses bustling in the hallway. Just the sound of my own heartbeat and the whisper of morning air through the window. Sat there for a long time, holding his still warm hand, memorizing his face in the peaceful repose of death. The funeral was held on a crisp October day, the maple trees around the cemetery blazing with red and gold. The turnout surprised me, not just family and friends, but dozens of people from the plant, from our neighborhood, from the bank where I worked, people whose lives David had touched, who wanted to pay their respects to a good man taken too young. Father McKenna spoke about David's courage in the face of illness, his love for his family, his dedication to his work. But as I sat in the front pew, listening to the eulogies, I found myself thinking about all the things left unsaid. No one mentioned 3 Mile Island except in passing. No one questioned why a healthy 38-year-old had developed such aggressive cancer. No one asked the questions that were keeping me awake at night. After the service, as friends and family gathered at our house, I slipped away to our bedroom and finally opened David's letter. His handwriting was shaky but determined. "My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, then my fight is over, but yours might just be beginning. Don't let them forget. Don't let them bury the truth with me. Keep living, but keep questioning. I love you always, David." I folded the letter carefully and put it in my jewelry box, next to my wedding ring. I didn't know then that it would take me 15 years to understand what he meant. Life after David moved in slow motion at first, then gradually picked up speed as I learned to navigate the world as a widow at 29. I kept the anniversary cards he'd given me in a small wooden box, evidence of a love that had been real, that had mattered, that deserved to be remembered. The first few years were the hardest. Everything reminded me of him: the empty space in our bed, the coffee mug that sat unused in the cabinet, the way other couples held hands without thinking about how precious and temporary that simple gesture could be. I sold our house in Middletown to many memories, too many reminders of dreams that would never come true, and moved to an apartment in Harrisburg. Work became my salvation. I threw myself into my career at the bank, earning promotions and taking on responsibilities that kept my mind occupied during the long daylight hours. By my mid-30s, I was a vice president, respected by my colleagues, financially stable in a way that David and I had only dreamed about during our married years. There were men who asked me out, kind, decent men who saw past the sadness I carried and imagined a future together. I dated a few of them, even had a relationship that lasted almost 2 years with Tom, a gentle accountant who never pushed me to talk about David, but clearly hoped I'd eventually stop mentioning him. "You can't live in the past forever, Margaret," my sister Carol said during one of her well-meaning interventions. "David would want you to be happy." But happiness felt like betrayal, not because I thought David would disapprove his final letter, had made his wishes clear, but because moving forward felt like leaving him behind. The grief had become so much a part of my identity that I wasn't sure who I would be without it. On the anniversary of his death each year, I'd visit his grave and tell him about my life, promotions at work, vacations I'd taken, books I'd read that he would have enjoyed. "I'm keeping my promise," I'd say to his headstone. "I'm still living." But was I really? Or was I just going through the motions, marking time until I could join him? The questions about his illness faded as the years passed. 3 Mile Island became history, the subject of documentaries and academic studies, rather than daily conversation. New nuclear accidents at Chernobyl and Fukushima dominated the headlines when people talked about nuclear safety at all. The plant workers I'd known either moved away or stopped talking about the old days. Occasionally, I'd run into someone from that time, a former neighbor, one of David's coworkers, and they'd ask how I was doing, mention that they still thought about him. But no one talked about the cancer, about the other workers who'd gotten sick, about the questions that had haunted me in those first years after his death. Maybe that was for the best. Maybe some grief was meant to be private, some losses too profound to be examined too closely. I'd made peace with the idea that David's death was simply one of life's cruel randomness, a reminder that we're all more fragile than we like to believe. Found the envelope on a Saturday afternoon in March, 15 years to the week after 3 Mile Island. I was finally preparing to move from my apartment to a small house I'd bought in Camp Hill. Going through boxes that had been stored in my closet for over a decade, most contained the predictable detritus of a marriage cut short, wedding gifts we'd never used, photo albums I couldn't bear to look at, David's college textbooks that I'd kept for reasons I couldn't explain. But this box was different. It contained David's personal items from the hospital. Things the nurses had given me in a plastic bag that I'd shoved away without examining. At the time, I couldn't face sorting through the remnants of his final days. Now, with 15 years of emotional distance, I thought I was ready. His watch was there, stopped at 2:47. His wallet, containing exactly $18, and a photo of us from our honeymoon. The clothes he'd worn to his last doctor's appointment, washed and folded by some thoughtful nurse. And at the bottom, a sealed manila envelope I'd never seen before, marked "Confidential Medical" in David's handwriting. My hands trembled as I held it. Why would David have hidden medical records, and why had no one mentioned this to me during his treatment? Inside were photocopies of documents I didn't recognize, forms with the Metropolitan Edison letterhead, radiation exposure readings, and medical monitoring reports dating back to March 1979. David's name was at the top of each page, along with employee number 4471, and detailed measurements of something called whole body exposure and thyroid dose. The numbers meant nothing to me, but the dates were unmistakable. March 28, 1979, the day of the accident. March 30th, April 2nd, April 15th, regular monitoring sessions that continued for months afterward, and scrawled in the margins, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were notes that made my blood run cold. Elevated levels. Requires ongoing surveillance. Do not discuss with employee. But it was the final document that stopped my heart. A medical assessment dated June 1983, just months before David's cancer diagnosis, noting significant radiation exposure during TMI incident and recommending aggressive cancer screening protocols. At the bottom, stamped in red ink, were the words, "Confidential, not for release to patient or family." I sat on my bedroom floor, surrounded by the scattered contents of our past, and felt the world shift beneath me. They had known, the plant officials, the company doctors, the radiation safety officers, they had all known that David was at risk, that his exposure levels were dangerous, that he needed monitoring, and they had said nothing. For 15 years, I'd carried the weight of senseless loss, the cruel randomness of a healthy young man, struck down by cancer. I'd comforted myself with the idea that sometimes bad things just happen, that David's death was tragic but unexplainable, but it wasn't random at all. It was preventable, and they had let it happen anyway. The grief I thought I'd made peace with transformed instantly into something else, a white-hot rage that started in my chest and spread through my entire body. I thought about David's final months, his desperate search for answers, his guilt about leaving me alone. I thought about Dr. Chen's puzzlement over his unusual case, her requests for exposure records that were supposedly unavailable. They had been available all along, hidden, classified, buried in confidential files while my husband died, believing his illness was just bad luck. I picked up each document, reading them more carefully now, trying to understand the technical language and measurement units. Some were internal memos between plant officials, others were medical reports signed by doctors I'd never heard of. All painted the same picture. David Sullivan, employee 4471, had received radiation exposure well above safe limits during the 3 Mile Island accident, and everyone in authority knew it. I spent the next 2 weeks consumed by research, transforming my dining room table into a makeshift investigation center. I started with what I knew, the dates and exposure levels from David's hidden records, and began building a timeline that would haunt my dreams for months to come. The Harrisburg Public Library became my second home. I requested every newspaper, article, government report, and academic study about 3 Mile Island I could find. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, seemed concerned about my sudden obsession with nuclear accidents, but she helped me navigate the microfiche machines and locate obscure technical documents that most people never bothered to read. What I discovered was a systematic pattern of deception that went far beyond my husband's case. The official story, the one I'd believed for 15 years, was that the accident released minimal radiation, that no one was seriously exposed, that there were no long-term health effects. But buried in the technical appendices of government reports and the fine print of academic studies was a different truth entirely. Internal documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests showed that radiation levels during the accident were far higher than initially reported. The plume of radioactive gases that escaped from the damaged reactor had exposed thousands of people in the surrounding area to dangerous levels of radiation, and the workers inside the plant, people like David, had received doses that were off the charts. I created my own timeline, cross-referencing David's work schedule with the hour-by-hour progression of the accident. On March 28, he'd been scheduled for maintenance work in the auxiliary building adjacent to the damaged reactor when the accident began. Instead of being evacuated, he and his team had been ordered to help with emergency response procedures work that put them directly in the path of radiation releases. The more I researched, the more patterns emerged. Mike Rodriguez, David's shift partner who'd died of thyroid cancer in 1987, Janet Walsh's husband Tom, who'd succumbed to liver cancer in 1989, Bob Henderson from next door, dead from leukemia in 1991. All plant workers, all exposed during the accident, all dead before age 50. I started making phone calls to other widows, other families who'd lost someone from the plant. The conversations were difficult. Many people didn't want to talk about their losses, or they'd convinced themselves, as I had, that the deaths were coincidental, but others were eager to share their stories. Linda Rodriguez broke down crying when I told her about David's hidden medical records. Mike had the same symptoms, she whispered. The fatigue, the nausea, everything. But the company doctors kept saying he was fine. Carol Brennan, whose husband had worked in the control room during the accident, told me about finding similar documents after his death from brain cancer. I tried to get answers, she said. But the lawyers told me I couldn't prove anything. The statute of limitations had run out. I was just supposed to accept it and move on. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, another name to my growing list of victims. But it was my call to Dr. Sarah Chen, David's former oncologist, that provided the most shocking revelation. Mrs. Sullivan, she said after I explained what I'd found, I've been wondering about this for years. After David's case, I started noticing an unusual pattern of cancers among 3 Mile Island workers. I tried to publish a study about it, but I was told that drawing connections between the plant and these illnesses would be irresponsible speculation. My research funding was pulled. The hospital administration made it clear that pursuing this line of inquiry would be detrimental to my career. The scope of the cover-up was staggering. It wasn't just about hiding David's exposure records. It was about suppressing any evidence that might connect the accident to subsequent illnesses. Scientists had been silenced, studies had been buried, and families had been left to grieve alone while the responsible parties protected their financial interests. I thought about David's final letter, his plea for me not to let them bury the truth with him. For 15 years, I'd failed him. But now I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a retired Nuclear Regulatory Commission inspector named James Kellerman, who contacted me after reading a letter I'd written to the Harrisburg Patriot News about David's case. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Harrisburg. A nervous man in his 70s who kept looking over his shoulder as if someone might be watching us. "I've been carrying this guilt for 20 years, he said, sliding a manila folder across the table. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid of losing my pension, my reputation. Now that I'm dying lung cancer, probably from all those years around Radio Schneifigger, I don't have much left to lose." Inside the folder was a classified government memo dated April 15, 1979, just weeks after the accident. The subject line read, "TMI worker, exposure levels, mitigation of public relations impact." What followed was a cold, calculated discussion of how to minimize public awareness of the true radiation doses received by plant workers. The actual exposure levels recorded during the emergency response phase significantly exceed previously established safety thresholds. The memo stated, "Immediate implementation of information control protocols is essential to prevent public panic and protect the long-term viability of the nuclear energy program." The document outlined a comprehensive strategy. Medical records would be classified, exposure data would be sanitized before release, and any health studies linking worker illnesses to radiation exposure would be discouraged or suppressed. Most chilling was the final recommendation. Long-term health monitoring should continue privately to assess actual impacts while maintaining public messaging that no significant exposures occurred. "They knew," Kellerman said quietly, watching me read. "From day one, they knew exactly how much radiation those workers received, and they made a conscious decision to hide it. Your husband and the others, they were sacrificed to protect the industry's reputation." Over the following weeks, Kellerman introduced me to a network of former officials, scientists, and whistleblowers who had been carrying pieces of the truth for decades. Each had their own story of being silenced, discredited, or pressured to remain quiet about what they knew. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a former epidemiologist with the Pennsylvania Department of Health, had been fired in 1985 for trying to conduct a comprehensive health study of TMI workers. I had preliminary data showing significant increases in cancer rates among exposed workers, she told me during a clandestine meeting at her home. When I tried to publish, I was told the study was methodologically flawed and that continuing would damage my career. They transferred me to a desk job reviewing restaurant inspections until I finally quit. Robert Chen, a former Metropolitan Edison engineer, revealed that company officials had destroyed key radiation monitoring equipment after the accident to prevent accurate exposure assessments. "We had dosimeters that recorded much higher readings than what was officially reported," he said. "Those devices mysteriously disappeared during the cleanup, along with a lot of other inconvenient evidence." The conspiracy reached the highest levels of government. Margaret Foster, a former aide to Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburgh during the crisis, showed me internal communications discussing the need to control the narrative about worker exposures. The governor was getting pressure from the White House, from the nuclear industry, from everyone who had a stake in maintaining public confidence in nuclear power. She explained, the truth about worker exposures was seen as too dangerous to reveal. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Dr. Michael Torres, a radiologist who had been part of the medical team monitoring TMI workers in the aftermath of the accident. He had kept copies of the original exposure reports, the real ones, before they were adjusted for public consumption. The levels some of these men received would have required immediate medical intervention under normal circumstances, he said. spreading the documents across his kitchen table. Instead, they were told everything was fine and sent back to work. It was criminal negligence on a massive scale. As the scope of the cover-up became clear, my anger evolved into something more focused and determined. This wasn't just about David anymore, it was about justice for dozens of workers who had died, for their families who had been lied to, and for the thousands of people in the surrounding community who had never been told the truth about their own exposures. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that having the truth and getting anyone to listen were two very different things. Finding lawyers willing to take on a 20-year-old nuclear cover-up proved more challenging than uncovering the evidence itself. Most firms I contacted were either intimidated by the scope of the case or worried about going up against powerful corporate and government interests. The few who were interested wanted enormous retainer fees that I couldn't afford, even with my savings from 15 years of careful financial planning. Then I met Patricia Hawkins, a civil rights attorney who had spent her career fighting David versus Goliath cases. Her small firm in Philadelphia specialized in environmental justice and corporate accountability, exactly what I needed. Even though she'd never handled a nuclear exposure case, the statute of limitations is going to be our biggest challenge, she explained during our first meeting, reviewing the documents I'd compiled. Most of these deaths occurred years ago, well beyond the normal filing deadline. But there's a legal principle called discovery rule. If plaintiffs couldn't reasonably have known about the cause of their injuries, the clock doesn't start ticking until they discover the connection, and David's hidden medical records prove we couldn't have known, I said, understanding immediately. Exactly. The deliberate concealment of exposure data constitutes fraud, which can extend or reset the statute of limitations. But we'll need more than documents. We need people willing to testify, families willing to go public, experts willing to stake their reputations on connecting these cancers to radiation exposure. Building that coalition became my full-time job. I took a leave of absence from the bank and threw myself into what Patricia called case development. I spent months tracking down other affected families, some of whom had moved far from Pennsylvania. To escape the painful memories associated with the area, the Brennan family had relocated to Arizona after Carol's husband died. I tried to forget about all of this, Carol told me during a long phone conversation. Moving away was supposed to give us a fresh start. But if there's a chance to get answers, to make them pay for what they did, I'll testify. Some families were harder to convince. The Rodriguez children, now adults, initially refused to participate. Mom went through hell fighting this battle alone, Linda's son Miguel told me. We watched it consume her, destroy her health. I won't put my family through that again. But when I showed him the classified documents proving that his father's exposure had been deliberately hidden, his resolve cracked. They really knew all along. They let him die knowing they could have prevented it. Yes, I said simply. And they're still covering it up. Working with Patricia, I developed a comprehensive legal brief that was part lawsuit, part historical document. We documented not just the individual cases of workers who had died, but the systematic pattern of deception that had enabled those deaths. The brief included medical evidence linking each worker's cancer to radiation exposure, supported by expert testimony from oncologists and radiation specialists, financial documentation showing the economic impact on families' lost wages, medical expenses, emotional damages, government documents proving the cover-up, including the classified memos Kellerman had provided, testimony from whistleblowers describing how they were silenced or pressured to remain quiet. The strongest part of our case was the expert testimony. Dr. Sarah Chen agreed to serve as our primary medical witness, reviewing each worker's case and explaining how the cancer patterns were consistent with radiation exposure. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a radiation health specialist from Johns Hopkins, analyzed the exposure data and concluded that the doses received by TMI workers were far above levels considered safe for occupational exposure. But we also needed to prove damages, not just medical expenses and lost wages, but the profound emotional and psychological impact of the cover-up itself. Patricia recommended that I work with Dr. Rachel Goldman, a psychologist who specialized in trauma cases involving institutional betrayal. What these families experienced goes beyond ordinary grief, Dr. Goldman explained after interviewing several widows. They've been carrying guilt and confusion for decades, believing their husbands' deaths were random tragedies, learning that those deaths were preventable, that authorities knew the risks and chose to hide them. That's a profound violation of trust that compounds the original trauma. As our legal brief grew to over 200 pages, I realized we were building more than a lawsuit. We were creating a historical record, documenting one of the most significant cover-ups in American nuclear history. The question was whether anyone in power would be willing to face that truth. The decision to go public came after months of legal preparation, hit a wall of bureaucratic stonewalling. Our requests for additional government documents were denied or heavily redacted. Corporate defendants claimed they couldn't locate records from the 1970s and 1980s. Even sympathetic officials told us privately that fighting the case in court could take decades. We need public pressure, Patricia advised during one of our strategy sessions. Sometimes the court of public opinion is more effective than an actual courtroom. I wasn't ready for the spotlight. 15 years of private grief had made me comfortable with anonymity, with processing my loss away from public scrutiny. But David's letter kept echoing in my mind. Don't let them bury the truth with me. My first media contact was with Rebecca Martinez, an investigative reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer who had covered nuclear safety issues for years. We met at a diner near Harrisburg, where I spread out documents across a corner booth, like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "This is incredible," Rebecca said, photographing page after page of classified memos and exposure records. "How long have you been sitting on this?" "I found the first documents 3 months ago," I explained. "But the cover-up has been going on for 20 years. Rebecca's article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition, under the headline, "TM Widow Exposes Radiation Cover-Up." The piece included David's photograph, young and smiling in his plant uniform, alongside quotes from the classified documents and testimony from other affected families. My phone started ringing before I finished reading the article. The first call was from my sister Carol, who was simultaneously proud and worried. "Margaret, this is huge. Are you sure you're ready for what's coming?" She was right to be concerned. Within hours, my answering machine was full of messages from reporters, advocacy groups, and other TMI families who had never known they weren't alone. But there were also threatening calls, anonymous voices warning me to stop stirring up trouble and let sleeping dogs lie. The nuclear industry's response was swift and predictable. Metropolitan Edison's successor company issued a statement dismissing my allegations as unsubstantiated claims from a grieving widow seeking financial compensation. Government officials questioned the authenticity of the documents I'd provided, suggesting they might be fabricated or taken out of context. But the story had momentum now. NBC's investigative unit picked it up, interviewing me for a primetime special about nuclear safety cover-ups. I sat in front of cameras for the first time in my life, my hands shaking as I held up David's hidden medical records and explained what they meant. "Mrs. Sullivan," the reporter asked, "what do you say to critics who claim you're exploiting your husband's death for financial gain?" "This isn't about money," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "This is about preventing other families from going through what we went through. My husband died believing his cancer was just bad luck. No family should have to carry that kind of false guilt." The interview aired on a Thursday evening in October. By Friday morning, my story had been picked up by news outlets across the country. Support letters began arriving from environmental groups, nuclear safety advocates, and ordinary people who had been touched by similar losses. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Other nuclear workers from plants across the country who had been wondering about their own mysterious illnesses, their own hidden exposure records, their own family members' unexplained cancers. "Thank you for having the courage to speak out," wrote one woman from Colorado whose husband had worked at Rocky Flats. "Reading your story made me realize we're not alone." I was beginning to understand that David's case wasn't isolated to 3 Mile Island. It was part of a much larger pattern of institutional deception that had affected thousands of families across the nuclear industry. Going public had transformed me from a private grieving widow into an accidental activist. There was no going back now. The media attention exploded beyond anything I could have imagined. Within 2 weeks of the Philadelphia Inquirer's story, my dining room table was covered with newspaper clippings from across the country. "Nuclear widow fights cover-up" from the Washington Post. "Hidden truth about 3 Mile Island" from USA Today. 20 years of lies from the Los Angeles Times. Each article brought new families forward. People who had been carrying similar suspicions for decades but had never known how to voice them or where to find support. My phone rang, constantly reporters wanting follow-up interviews, documentary filmmakers requesting access, other nuclear families sharing their own stories of loss and betrayal. Among the most powerful responses was from Maria Santos, whose husband had worked at the San Onofre nuclear plant in California. After reading about your case, she wrote, I went through Roberto's old papers and found radiation exposure records that were never explained to us. He died of the same type of leukemia as your husband, at almost the same age. I think we need to talk. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Nuclear workers across the country had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation during accidents and routine operations, but their families had never been told the truth about the risks or the consequences. 60 Minutes called, wanting to do a segment about the broader implications of nuclear industry cut. The producer, Janet Williams, flew to Harrisburg to interview me and several other affected families who had come forward after seeing the initial coverage. What we're seeing here, Janet explained during our pre-interview, isn't just about 3 Mile Island. This appears to be a systematic pattern of deception that spans decades and involves multiple nuclear facilities. Your case has opened the floodgates. The 60 Minutes piece aired on a Sunday evening in November, reaching an audience of over 20 million viewers. The segment included leaked documents from other nuclear facilities, interviews with additional whistleblowers, and expert testimony about the health effects of radiation exposure that had been suppressed for decades. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Congressional offices reported hundreds of calls demanding investigations. Environmental groups launched petition drives calling for nuclear industry accountability. Most importantly, families affected by similar cover-ups began organizing, creating a network of support and advocacy that extended far beyond my individual case. But the media storm also brought intense scrutiny of my personal life. Tabloid reporters dug through my background, looking for any detail that might discredit my story, my relationships, my financial situation. Even my decision to remain childless after David's death became subjects of public speculation. Nuclear Widow's Secret Past ran in one particularly nasty publication, suggesting that I had ulterior motives for speaking out. The story was complete fiction, but it was picked up by industry-friendly websites and repeated until some people began to believe it. The emotional toll was exhausting. Every television appearance required me to relive David's death, to explain again why I hadn't spoken out sooner, to defend my credibility against attacks from people who had never lost someone to preventable radiation exposure. Are you having second thoughts about going public? My sister asked during one of her supportive phone calls. Sometimes, I admitted, but then I get another letter from a family who thought they were alone, who finally has answers after decades of wondering. That makes it worth it. The media attention was also creating political pressure that couldn't be ignored. Congressional representatives who had previously dismissed nuclear safety concerns were now calling for hearings. Government agencies that had stonewalled our document requests were suddenly finding previously lost files. 20 years after David's death, the truth was finally breaking free from the careful control of corporate and government spin doctors. But I was learning that exposing the truth was only the first step. Making people accountable for that truth would be an even bigger fight. The call from Congressman Kel Torres's office came on a cold December morning, just weeks after the 60 Minutes segment aired. As chairman of the House Subcommittee on Energy and Environment, Torres had the authority to launch congressional hearings into nuclear industry practices, and the public pressure to act was becoming impossible to ignore. Mrs. Sullivan, his chief of staff, explained, "The congressman would like to invite you to testify before the subcommittee about your experiences with the 3 Mile Island cover-up. Your testimony could be instrumental in bringing about real reforms in nuclear safety oversight." Testifying before Congress felt surreal. 6 months earlier, I had been a quiet bank executive, living with private grief. Now I was being asked to speak truth to power in the halls of the Capitol, to representatives who could actually change the laws that had allowed David's death to be covered up for 20 years. I spent weeks preparing my testimony with Patricia's help, crafting a statement that would be both personally compelling and legally precise. We knew this might be our only chance to get the full story on the official record, to force government officials to respond publicly to the evidence we had uncovered. The hearing room was packed when I arrived that January morning. television, cameras lined the walls, reporters filled the gallery, and the witness table where I would sit faced a semicircle of congressional representatives who held the power to demand accountability or dismissed the whole matter as ancient history. Congressman Torres called the hearing to order with unusual gravity. "We are here today to examine allegations of a systematic cover-up regarding radiation exposure of workers at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility," he began. "These are serious charges that go to the heart of public trust in our regulatory systems." When my turn came to speak, I looked directly at the committee members and began with the words I had rehearsed but which still felt like they were tearing from my heart. "My name is Margaret Sullivan, and my husband David died from leukemia because officials at 3 Mile Island and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission chose to hide the truth about his exposure rather than protect his health." I told David's story methodically, holding up the hidden medical records, reading from the classified memos, explaining how the cover-up had robbed us of the chance to seek proper treatment or make informed decisions about our future. The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. "The documents prove that my husband received radiation doses that exceeded safe limits by orders of magnitude," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each sentence. "Officials knew this, monitored the health effects, and chose to classify the information rather than warn the workers or their families. This wasn't an oversight or bureaucratic confusion, it was a deliberate decision to value corporate interests over human lives." The questions from committee members ranged from sympathetic to skeptical. Representative Sarah Klein from Oregon asked pointed questions about the timeline of the cover-up and the number of families affected. Representative John Morrison from Texas seemed more interested in defending the nuclear industry, suggesting that my allegations were based on incomplete information and emotional trauma rather than solid evidence. "Mrs. Sullivan," Morrison said, "isn't it possible that your husband's cancer was simply a tragic coincidence and that you're seeing patterns that don't actually exist?" I had been waiting for this question, and I met his gaze directly. "Congressman Morrison, 37 workers from 3 Mile Island have died from cancers typically associated with radiation exposure. The probability of that being coincidence is approximately 1 in 10 million. But more importantly, we don't have to rely on probability. We have documents proving that officials knew about dangerous exposure levels and chose to hide them." Most dramatic moment came when former NRC Inspector James Kellerman took the witness stand, now visibly frail from his own cancer. He spoke in a voice barely above a whisper as he confirmed the authenticity of the classified documents and described the pressure he had faced to remain silent. "I have carried this guilt for 20 years, he said, tears streaming down his face. "I knew that workers like David Sullivan were dying from radiation exposure, and I did nothing to stop it. I hope this hearing can prevent other families from suffering the way the Sullivans have suffered." By the end of the day, the evidence was overwhelming. Government officials who testified were forced to acknowledge that proper oversight had failed, that documents had been improperly classified, and that affected families deserved both answers and accountability. But I knew that congressional hearings, no matter how dramatic, were just the beginning. Real change would require sustained pressure, ongoing vigilance, and the political will to take on powerful interests that had been operating in the shadows for decades. The congressional hearings created momentum that even the most powerful corporate lawyers couldn't stop. Within months, multiple lawsuits were filed on behalf of TMI workers and their families, armed with the classified documents and expert testimony that had emerged during the investigation. But more importantly, the Department of Justice launched its own criminal investigation into the cover-up, treating it as potential obstruction of justice and conspiracy to defraud. The legal victories came faster than anyone had expected. The first breakthrough was a ruling by federal judge Maria Rodriguez that the statute of limitations had indeed been extended due to the fraudulent concealment of evidence. When defendants actively hide information that would allow plaintiffs to understand the cause of their injuries, she wrote, they cannot later claim the protection of time limitations. Patricia and her legal team had grown into a formidable coalition of attorneys representing over 60 families across multiple nuclear facilities. The evidence pattern we had established at 3 Mile Island was being replicated at plants from California to New York, creating a class action lawsuit that demanded fundamental changes in how the nuclear industry handled worker safety in public disclosure. The first settlement was announced on a crisp morning in March, Almost exactly 25 years after the 3 Mile Island accident, Metropolitan Edison's successor company, along with several government contractors, agreed to pay $847 million to affected families, not just for medical expenses and lost wages, but for the decades of deception that had compounded their grief. This isn't just about money, I told reporters gathered outside the federal courthouse in Philadelphia. It's about acknowledgement. For the first time, these companies are admitting that they knew workers were exposed to dangerous radiation levels and that they chose to hide that information. But the financial settlements were only part of the victory. More important were the structural changes that emerged from the legal pressure and congressional oversight. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission was forced to implement new transparency requirements, mandating that all worker exposure records be made available to employees and their families within 30 days of any incident. The classification of health and safety information was severely restricted. An independent oversight of nuclear facility medical monitoring was established. Dr. Sarah Chen was appointed to head a new federal commission charged with reviewing historical exposure cases and ensuring that affected families received proper medical care and compensation. Margaret's courage in speaking out has created a model for how we should handle these cases, she told the commission during its first meeting. Truth and transparency must be the foundation of any industry that poses risks to public health. The personal victory for me was bittersweet. Numbered amount of money or official acknowledgement could bring David back or erase the 20 years I had spent believing his death was simply cruel fate. But seeing other families finally get answers, watching the nuclear industry be forced to accept accountability, felt like fulfilling the promise I had made to David's memory. The most meaningful moment came when Linda Rodriguez, Mike's widow, called to tell me that her family's settlement would allow her daughter to attend medical school. She wants to be an oncologist, Linda said through tears. She says, if there are going to be more cases like her father's, she wants to be ready to help. James Kellerman didn't live to see the final settlements his own cancer claimed him just weeks after his congressional testimony, but his daughter contacted me to say that his final months had been peaceful, for the first time in 20 years. He kept saying that he could finally sleep at night, she told me. He felt like he had done the right thing at last. The criminal investigation resulted in indictments of 3 former company officials and 2 government contractors for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. While some of the key players had died or were too old to prosecute effectively, the message was clear. Covering up public health risks would no longer be treated as a cost of doing business. As I signed the final settlement documents, I thought about David's last letter and his plea not to let them bury the truth with him. 25 years after his death, that truth was finally free, and it was protecting other families from suffering the way we had suffered. The impact of our victory extended far beyond 3 Mile Island and the families directly affected by the cover-up. Within 2 years, similar investigations were launched at nuclear facilities across the country, as workers and communities that had long suspected health problems finally had a framework for demanding answers. My mailbox became a constant source of both inspiration and heartbreak. Letters arrived daily from families who had found their own hidden documents, workers who were finally getting proper medical monitoring, and communities that were organizing to demand transparency from nearby nuclear facilities. Dear Mrs. Sullivan, wrote one woman from Nevada whose husband had worked at the nuclear test site. Your story gave me the courage to ask questions I should have asked 30 years ago. We found exposure records that show my husband received doses that should have required immediate medical attention. Thank you for showing us that we don't have to accept that's just how things are as an answer. I had inadvertently become a spokesperson for nuclear accountability, traveling to communities across the country to share what I had learned about fighting institutional cover. Each speaking engagement brought new cases to light, new families seeking justice, new evidence of the systematic deception that had characterized the nuclear industry for decades. The changes went beyond individual cases. Universities began offering courses on environmental justice that used our case as a model for community organizing. Law schools taught classes on how to challenge corporate secrecy using freedom of information laws and public pressure. Medical schools implemented new protocols for reporting suspected occupational illnesses, ensuring that patterns like the one we uncovered at TMI would be identified more quickly in the future. Most importantly, the nuclear industry itself was forced to change. The transparency requirements that emerged from our legal victories became standard practice across the industry. Worker health monitoring was taken out of the hands of company doctors and given to independent medical professionals. Exposure records were no longer treated as proprietary information but as public health data that belonged to the workers and communities at risk. The personal transformation was equally profound. I had gone from being a private person carrying silent grief to becoming an accidental activist whose story had helped change federal policy. The bank where I had worked for 15 years welcomed me back with a promotion, recognizing that the investigative and organizational skills I developed during the fight could be valuable in their compliance and risk management departments. But the most meaningful changes were in the relationships I had built with other affected families. We had created an informal network of support that extended across the country, people who understood the unique pain of learning that a loved one's death had been preventable, who could offer comfort and guidance to newly affected families. Carol, Brennan, and I became particularly close, bonding over our shared experience of being told we were just grieving widows who couldn't understand complex technical issues. They tried to dismiss us because we weren't scientists or lawyers, she said during one of our regular phone calls, but we had something more important. We had the truth, and we weren't going to let them bury it. The ripple effects continued to spread in ways I never could have anticipated. Environmental groups cited our case when challenging new nuclear facilities. Journalists used the documents we had uncovered to investigate other instances of corporate cover-ups. Government officials who had been involved in the original deception found their careers effectively ended when the truth came to light. Perhaps most importantly, we had established a precedent that ordinary people could challenge powerful institutions and when that grief could be transformed into justice, that individual stories could create systemic change, and that the truth, however long buried, eventually finds a way to the surface. 20-5 years after David's death, his story had become part of something much larger than either of us could have imagined. The memorial dedication took place on a beautiful September morning. Exactly 25 years after David's death, the bronze plaque was mounted on a granite stone in Riverside Park, overlooking the Susquehanna River and the cooling towers of 3 Mile Island in the distance. The inscription read, "In memory of David Sullivan and all nuclear workers whose service cost them their lives. Their sacrifice was not in vain. Their truth lives on." Standing before the small crowd of family members, fellow advocates, and community leaders, I felt David's presence more strongly than I had in years. Not the sick, dying man from his final months, but the young engineer who had believed he was building a better future, who had trusted his employers to protect his safety, who had died never knowing that his illness was preventable. David would be amazed by what has happened because of his story, I said, addressing the group gathered for the dedication. Not just the legal victories or the policy changes, but the community of people who have found their voice, who refuse to accept that accidents happen when those accidents are really the result of deliberate choices to put profits before people. The memorial had been funded by contributions from affected families across the country, people whose own battles for truth and justice had been inspired by our fight. It represented something larger than David's individual story. It was a symbol of accountability, a reminder that ordinary people have the power to challenge institutional deception, and a promise to future generations that their health and safety matter more than corporate convenience. After the ceremony, I walked alone to David's grave a few miles away. The headstone looked smaller than I remembered, weathered by 25 years of Pennsylvania seasons. I knelt beside it and placed a copy of the final settlement agreement on the ground, weighted down with a small stone so the wind wouldn't carry it away. "We did it," I whispered, feeling foolish but needing to say the words. "The truth is finally out. They can't hide what happened to you anymore." I thought about the letter he had left me, the plea not to let them bury the truth with him. For 15 years, I had failed that promise, accepting the official story and living with quiet grief. But in the end, his words had guided me to this moment, to justice, to accountability, to the knowledge that his death had meaning beyond the random cruelty I had originally believed it to be. The fight had changed me in ways I was still discovering. The shy bank employee, who had once avoided confrontation, had become someone willing to take on powerful institutions, to speak truth in congressional hearing rooms, to transform personal loss into public action. I had found strength I never knew, one possessed in purpose I never expected to need. But more than anything, I had learned that love doesn't end with death, it transforms. My love for David had evolved from private grief into public advocacy, from personal loss into community building, from individual suffering into systemic change. Every family that received proper medical monitoring because of the transparency requirements we had, one was a testament to David's memory. Every worker who would never have to die believing their illness was just bad luck was a victory for the truth. He had asked me to protect Dot. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the future. The memorial would stand as a reminder, the policy changes would protect other workers, and the precedent we had set would help other communities fight their own battles for truth and justice. David's legacy was no longer measured in the years he had lost to cancer, but in the lives that would be saved by the accountability his story had demanded. That seemed like a pretty good way to change the world.